Before your old life ends, listen to this. There is a place where you've been standing for a while now. You pass through it every day. You slow your pace. You watch the movement. You hesitate, and then keep going as if you hadn't noticed. Little by little, it became part of your routine to ignore the exact point where something begins to ask for passage. Because crossing would mean moving away from everything you learned to call normal. From everything that once made sense. From everything that, for a long time, protected you. It still works. It still holds. It still feels safe. But it requires care, adjustment, containment, and at some point, without warning, you realize. It's not that you changed too much. It's that this place can no longer keep up with the size of who you've become. You didn't stay there by accident. You learned how to stay. You learned where to position yourself so you wouldn't draw attention. Which times to look at the boards, and which moments to pretend you didn't see. At first, you still checked the schedules. Later, you started recognizing the sounds. The distant announcement. The movement that comes before arrival. You know when a train is approaching. You always have. But there's a difference between knowing and standing up. So you stay a little longer. You adjust your posture. You find a comfortable way to wait without having to admit that you've been waiting too long. Over time, you start measuring your days not by what happens, but by what you manage to avoid. You avoid the exact moment when you'd have to cross the platform and admit that this waiting is no longer just an interval. And the most curious part is that nothing is stopping you from going. There's no announcement blocking the way. No closed doors. Just that subtle feeling that leaving now would change more things than you're ready to reorganize. From the outside, this always looked reasonable. Waiting is usually seen as prudence. Staying a little longer as responsibility. Not deciding yet as maturity. No one finds it strange to see someone standing on a platform. It's a place designed for that. There, you don't look lost. You look careful, like someone who prefers to observe before acting. And for a while, that interpretation works. People pass by. Schedules keep moving. Life continues happening around you without requiring you to move along with it. There's even a certain quiet respect for those who don't rush. For those who don't board just any train just to say they went. So you remain there without raising suspicion. Without external conflict. Without visible pressure. Everything seems normal. Acceptable. Even admirable. And that's exactly why almost no one notices when waiting starts to stop being just waiting. You didn't stay there out of indecision. There was a moment when staying was the most sensible choice available. Leaving earlier would have required answers you didn't yet have. The courage to take on consequences that didn't fit that point in your life. So you did what made sense. You observed more. You waited for clearer signs. You chose not to move while there was still too much at stake. That wasn't weakness. It was situational awareness. Staying gave you time. Time to understand what still mattered. Time not to lose what still needed to be preserved. The station fulfilled that role. It held you when moving forward too soon would have cost stability, relationships, identity. None of this was a mistake. None of this was delay. But there is a quiet difference between using the station as shelter and beginning to organize your entire life as if that were the final destination. And that's where something changes. Not because the decision to stay was wrong, but because it has already delivered everything it had to offer. At some point, the sensation changes. It's not anxiety. It's not urgency. It's not fear. It's something more discreet. You're still on the same platform, but you can no longer find the same comfortable position. The bench feels narrow. Standing requires more attention. Time weighs differently. Nothing happened on the outside. The schedules remain the same. People keep passing by. The discomfort doesn't come from the station. It comes from the fact that you no longer fit into it the way you once did. What used to be shelter now requires too much adjustment, too much care, too much containment. And not because something went wrong, but because something moved forward. The body notices before the mind. The restlessness appears not as a call to rush, but as a signal of misalignment. It's not a push. It's a low warning. Like staying too long in a position that no longer distributes the weight properly. The station didn't change. And you didn't change too much. You just no longer fit, in the same way, in the same space. There is a part of you that would rather you remain right where you are. It knows this place. It knows where to rest the weight. It knows how to move through time without making noise. It remembers what works. What has already been tested. What doesn't demand immediate reorganization. It points to familiar schedules and says there's no urgency. That other trains always come. That waiting a little longer has never been the problem. This voice doesn't shout. It organizes. It lines up the arguments. Talks about stability. About what you built while you stayed. About the cost of moving too early. And in many moments, it was right. Staying was coherent. Staying prevented ruptures you weren't ready to hold yet. This voice doesn't want to stop you from living. It only wants to make sure you don't lose what still matters. The problem was never listening to it. The problem begins when it starts deciding how much longer you should remain. There's a simple reason the platform feels safer than movement. It's familiar. You know exactly where to place your foot. You know how long the silence lasts between one train and the next. You know when to look and when to pretend you didn't notice. Nothing there demands immediate adaptation. Everything has already been rehearsed. Movement is different. It requires dealing with what hasn't taken shape yet. With reactions you can't predict. With versions of yourself that have never had to sustain themselves in motion. The body prefers what it recognizes, even when it no longer distributes the weight well. Not because it's better, but because it's predictable. On the platform, risk has an outline. In movement, it doesn't have a name yet. And that's why staying can look like maturity for such a long time. It's not cowardice. It's not irrational attachment. It's simply the mind trying to preserve a familiar territory while something internal reorganizes itself in silence. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem begins when predictability starts to matter more than coherence. None of this happens as a big moment. There's no announcement, no total clarity, no sense of victory like you might have imagined. When something truly begins to change, it's almost always too quiet to seem important. Getting on the train doesn't come with certainty. It comes with stillness. It doesn't feel like courage. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like an internal adjustment that no longer asks for explanations. On the outside, nothing draws attention. You're still there. The day goes on. Things keep functioning. But on the inside, something stops pushing, stops justifying, stops negotiating all the time. Change doesn't arrive as an answer. It arrives as a cessation. Like when the body finally stops holding a position that's been requiring constant effort. It's not a leap. It's a strange release. Quiet. Almost imperceptible. And precisely because of that, so easy to underestimate. That internal movement doesn't go unnoticed for long. Not because you announce it, but because you stop adjusting the way you used to. Some people notice immediately. Others feel it without knowing how to explain it. Something in the way you carry yourself changes, not to draw attention, but to stop occupying the wrong space. Conversations become shorter. Some expectations stop being met. Certain invitations no longer make as much sense. None of this is dramatic. It's subtle. Some people move closer, as if they recognize something familiar in you. And others feel unsettled, not because you changed too much, but because you stopped adapting in silence. You no longer explain as much. You no longer anticipate reactions. You no longer move to keep everything comfortable. And this creates small pauses, new silences, a slight misalignment between who you are now and who still expects the old version. The station starts to feel different when you're no longer trying to fit into it the same way. This is where the urge to step back appears, not as fear, but as a quiet invitation to return to what once worked. The platform is still there, just as it was, familiar, ready to receive you without questions. It would be easy to adjust your pace again, to explain a little more, to anticipate reactions, to reduce the inner movement just enough for everything to feel stable again. No one would stop you. No one would demand anything. And for a moment, this looks like maturity. Because going back doesn't require courage. It only requires memory. The body recognizes the path. It knows exactly how to fit itself again, how to belong without friction. This is the point where many people return. Not because the change isn't worth it, but because the old adjustment still knows how to offer immediate relief. And the most dangerous part of that is that it almost never feels like a choice. It just feels like common sense. Perhaps the hardest part of this phase is accepting that nothing needs to be proven. You don't need certainty. You don't need to feel brave. You don't need to know how to explain what's changing. There's nothing wrong with you for still feeling ambivalent, for still looking at the platform with familiarity. That doesn't cancel what has already reorganized inside you. Not all clarity arrives as a decision. Sometimes it appears as the absence of conflict, as something that simply stops asking for defense. You're not late. You're not failing. You're not losing anything essential. You're simply no longer sustaining a position that has already served its purpose, and that, by itself, is already a form of alignment. No promise, no guarantee, no defined ending. Just the quiet sense that nothing in you is broken for feeling exactly what you're feeling right now. The train keeps passing. Maybe without urgency. Maybe without absolute clarity. But it passes. You're still on the platform. Nothing has been announced. Nothing has been demanded. There's no countdown. No audience. No one watching to see whether you go or stay. There is only this quiet space between what no longer serves and what doesn't yet have a name. The station isn't holding you back. It simply remains until staying begins to cost more than moving. And maybe the point isn't crossing right now. Maybe it's noticing that you're no longer waiting in the same way. Because when the waiting changes, life begins to change too. Even if nothing visible has happened yet. And if you close this video and pretend none of this touched you, tomorrow everything goes on the same. But if some part of you recognized this place, then, in some way, the movement has already begun. Hold on to that.